What if I told you that one of the Axis powers and one of the Allied powers actually had a pact with each other during most of World War II? This is the story of the Soviet-Japanese Empire Neutrality Treaty, which was signed on April 13th, 1941 in Moscow between the Japanese foreign ambassador, the Japanese foreign minister, as well as the Soviet foreign minister, Molotov. And the reason for this treaty, or not even treaty, but pact being signed between these two supposedly warring powers was signed, is multi-layered, as usual. And the Soviets' interest in this pact was because they wanted to be free of any obligation to defend their Eastern Front, and so they could focus everything on the Western Front, throw everything they have in Nazi Germany. In this regard, for the Soviets, the treaty was a smashing success. Meanwhile, Japan had similar motives. They didn't want to have to defend their northern front in Manchuria. They were also involved in an extensive war with China, and they wanted to also be able to focus their remaining majority of their energy on the United States, which they tipped their hand at Pearl Harbor earlier in 1940. And so that part was pretty obvious to everybody involved. But the Soviets did not want to fight an Eastern Front or a two-front war. The Japanese didn't want to fight a three-front war because they already had two fronts. One in China, one against the United States. Again, they tipped their hat off at Pearl Harbor. And so, with this scenario, the two countries signed a treaty in Moscow on April 13th, again, of 1941, which was basically a date labeled as a neutrality pact. It wasn't an alliance by any means, but they just simply said that they would not attack each other, which largely held for most of the remaining war. Again, it was signed in April of 1941. However, this pact was eventually renounced by the Soviets on April 8th of 1945, which is Victory in Europe Day, which is when the Nazis, on the same day that the Nazis surrendered, Nazi Germany surrendered to all of the Allies. The Soviets suddenly decided we don't need this treaty anymore because they had their eyes on Manchuria. And so they had no more war left to fight on the Western Front. And so they could move all of their forces back across Soviet Union all the way back to the east, which they eventually did. Now, the Japanese feared the Soviets tremendously because they actually made an attempted attack of their own in Manchuria in 1939, 2 years before this pact was signed. The Japanese were routed. They were destroyed. And so they were absolutely fearful of Nazi Germany. Of the Soviet Union. In some ways, they were afraid of Nazi Germany too, but that's a different story for a different day. And so, this treaty lasted until April 8th of 1945, which coincided, of course, with Victory in Europe Day in Germany, ending the war on the Western Front. The war continued on the Eastern Front, of course, through the next few months, until, lo and behold, the United States dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki later in 1945. This treaty actually technically was supposed to exist until April 8th of 1946. However, there was a clause, not entirely hidden, but it was somewhat concealed clause within this pact that allowed the pact to be renounced up to 1 year before the end of the scheduled end of the treaty, which would have been April 8th of 1946. The fact that VE Day happened on April 8th of 1945, of course, is an absolute coincidence. The Soviets did not intend, they did not have any dates scheduled for the German surrender and to have defeated Nazi Germany. It's basically by blind luck that this happened. And so the treaty was announced on April 8th. The Soviets proceeded to start marching their armies eastward across the Soviet Union, which is, as you probably already realize, a massive distance of several thousand kilometers. It would have taken months to complete. However, the United States made that irrelevant by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the summer of 1945. So the Russian troops had not even made it all the way east yet to launch their attack on Japan when Fat Man and Little Boy, the names of the bombs, hit the Japanese cities, and Japan surrendered outright. So unconditional surrender prevented them from getting attacked in Manchuria in the future. Well, actually it did and it didn't. Because Russia eventually did wind up taking some of Manchuria later on. They didn't take all of it. But had the war not been surrendered by Japan at the point that they did in the summer of 1945, I think you're looking at a much more catastrophic result for them, particularly the north. Who knows, maybe even the northernmost main island of Hokkaido might have been threatened as well. It's hard to tell, but anyway, that was the end of the Russian-Soviet Neutrality Pact. And when Hitler learned of this pact being signed back in 1941, he was not amused. He was actually furious. He demanded the appearance of Japan's ambassador at his Berlin headquarters. And then he also sent a diplomatic cable demanding an explanation from the Japanese ambassador and foreign minister in Tokyo. Answers which the Japanese were understandably quite dodgy about. But this pact did not make Hitler happy in the least. But with that said, that's the story. That indeed one of the Allied powers and one of the Axis powers did have a non-invasion pact. And unlike the one between Germany and Russia in the early 1940s, this one largely held until it no longer had to. Whereas, of course, Hitler stabbed Stalin in the back and launched Operation Barbarossa in early 1941, which actually caused the Japanese Neutrality Pact to be created to begin with, so that Stalin could throw everything he had at the Germans. Which is why Hitler was angry at Japan, furious, livid, because he wanted to force the Soviets to fight a war on two fronts. But the Japanese, because of what happened in 1939, were rightfully afraid of it, because they had been routed by them earlier. That said, if Japan had refused the pact, I'm not sure the overall outcome changes very much, because the Soviets were technologically superior to the Japanese, and their soldiers' training was far superior to the Japanese, particularly for the relatively modern kind of warfare that was being unleashed on the world at the time. So there it is, guys. The Soviet-Japanese Empire Neutrality Treaty of 1941. Hope you enjoyed your Sunday. My Broncos won. Hopefully your team did as well. The local team here, the Minnesota Vikings, put on an absolute clinic, completely unexplained. We're wondering where the heck this team has been all season. But nonetheless, here we are. Enjoy your Sunday night. Get some rest. Getting ready to go back to work tomorrow. We're in the office for this week. And we will see you tomorrow night. Peace out, homies.